Welcome everybody to Solo Ship Week 18. It's the season finale. JM, are you ready for the full circle of chaos in the NFL?
Can you be ready? Is it possible to be ready for this week? Yeah, it's a strange one. We'll get into it. Before we do, though, a little bit bummed to be doing our last show. Had a lot of fun doing this year. Looking forward to running it back again next year for sure. Yeah,
absolutely. It's been a great show. I mean, it's been, I think it might be my best NFL season ever. It's close to it. This show has helped me out a lot. I hope it helps the audience.
Yeah. You know what? Actually, it hasn't been my best season, but I've had a really, really strong season, really good results this season. And definitely this show every week, there's little things that I've picked up from things, you know, how that works, right? Things that you say and you kind of hear yourself say it and you're like, oh yeah. And then things that you've said that have also triggered other thoughts for me. So yeah, if it hasn't been valuable for viewers, at least it's been valuable for us. So we've lined our pockets as a result of this show.
Right, we'll keep going no matter what.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so, you know, obviously week 18, you've got like a lot of stuff is in flux. And I think even during slate, a lot of things could be in flux just as teams like determine their playoff positioning. I think it's starting to come out really today. You know, teams are starting to say, well, we're definitely going to rest this guy, or, you know, we're starting this person. I think like right before we hit record, like James Conner was declared out. So like that's, you know, going to affect the Arizona situation. But there's some, I'm kind of focusing on what we can control, like what we know and what we can control. Like targeting games with higher point totals, like the Vegas point totals still tend to be the most accurate thing we can find. Finding teams that have high implied point totals, knowing the teams that have something left to play for, and avoiding timeshares and situations where teams might be resting half their guys, you know, or like resting guys half the game. And then just, you know, paying attention to late swap. I think there's a couple of teams playing in the 4 p.m. window that might not have something to play for by the time the game starts. And that could affect things, but it could not if the team's preparing the whole week, thinking that they might have something to play for. And then also just being aware, like there's going to be so much value that salary might not matter. And the winning tournament lineup is probably going to be farther from the actual optimal lineup this week than in any other week.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put that as well. I think one of the things you alluded to this, but one of the mistakes that people make in this week, not necessarily by the time they're building rosters, but in their preparation throughout the week, is we're so focused on who are the teams that are resting players and what backups might be getting extra work or what young guys might be getting extra work that we tend to forget, like I was going through the Washington Dallas write up for the NFL Edge, and it's like, you know, Washington might be doing these things, and Dallas probably has something they have something to play for, but maybe if Philadelphia is winning by a lot, maybe they start resting players, and then you like back up and it's like it's still a game with a 40-point total, and Washington's implied to score 16.5, and Dallas's high-priced players implied to score 23.5, and Zeke hasn't topped 18.1 points all season, and CeeDee Lamb has only hit in 2 shootouts this year, and Tony Pollard is $7K, right? Needs so much to go right to pay off his salary, and it's like we can still say, like let's zoom out, and instead of trying to find the random gem as our starting point, let's have our starting point be where are the good spots against the backdrop of how we would typically look at things on a normal slate. And so one of the things that stands out to me is early in the week, looking at quarterbacks, it was like, okay, Joe Burrow, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, they're all good quarterbacks, elite quarterbacks with elite DFS upside and something to play for. And then look at ownership projections today, and it's like those three are the 3 highest projected owned quarterbacks, but not by like a huge margin, right? And so it seems like the field is definitely understanding that those are the best spots, but also probably not quite as much as they should be looking at that. And so I think that's one of the things that we can look at is through the lens of where do we have something that's like a normal week, right? The Eagles need to win this game in order to be the number 1 seed. The Vikings need to win their game in order to have a shot at the number 2 seed. The 49ers play in the late window, so there's no concern about them resting guys there. So spots like that are spots that I want to be paying attention to in particular, where we have elite offenses, especially in this low scoring season across the board. Elite offenses with high probability of scoring a lot of points with something to play for. I think those are interesting spots to be paying attention to this week for sure.
Yeah, and I think you just named the teams with the highest implied point totals on the week. And I think it's reflected in the Vegas lines that there are teams that have, good players that have been good players all season that still have things to play for. So like Philadelphia needs to win their game. I'm actually maybe a little bit lower on Jalen Hurts in the field. I think he might end up being the highest owned quarterback, but I am a little bit worried with him coming back from injury that might affect things a little bit. And you still have like Josh Allen, you still have Joe Burrow, you still have like Dak Prescott, and then it gets ugly.
Really thin, yeah, really quickly.
I mean, we kind of thought that last week though as well, and some guys ended up putting higher scores than we would have expected. I think Kirk Cousins is in play. I don't know. Like you think about, there's going to be a lot of value there at quarterback. Like Sam Howell is somebody that I have a little bit of interest in, but it's true. Like Washington's implied point total is like 16 points. So I think I'm probably going to focus on the higher priced quarterbacks that have something to play for, maybe a little bit less so on Jalen Hurts, just because I think it was a shoulder injury. So they're not going to run him as much.
Yeah, but on that note, I do think it's interesting that his three low volume rushing games were three of his best games of the year, right? I mean, Tennessee, he put up 37.4. Pittsburgh, he put up 28.4. The first game against Washington, he put up 30.6. I think we still have a perception of Jalen, like obviously the injury was to his right shoulder, so that affects his throwing as well. But I do think that there's an aspect of like, if they're running him less, it doesn't necessarily change his value as dramatically as we would think on the surface, so much as it maybe changes his pass catcher's value, right? Like the chances of A.J. Brown hitting go up a little bit if Jalen Hurts is throwing the ball a little bit more. At the same time, they're playing a Giants team that should be resting most of their key starters and really bad against, they're now 32nd in DVOA against the run, right? So no reason for the Eagles to not just say, well, let's just Miles Sanders type of game. So Miles Sanders at 5,900, no less, right? And only projected up right now on OWS, like 10.7% owned. That might go up a little bit, but because of how volatile he is, his ownership never really gets too far out of control. So, I mean, I can see that argument. I think that Jalen Hurts still kind of stays in the mix for me, but I can certainly see that argument against Jalen Hurts. And then you still have other guys to choose from, right? Josh Allen has a tough matchup against the Patriots, but last year, 7 drives, 7 touchdowns against the Patriots in the playoffs. So he's certainly capable of blowing up in that spot. Joe Burrow capable of blowing up against Baltimore. And when we talk about savings, I want to think about like, where can I spend those savings that it actually helps me win a tournament, right? If I'm paying down at quarterback and it lets me get Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase and A.J. Brown or something, then I'm on board for that. But if it's just paying down and getting 16 to 20 points and we leave alone these 30, 35 pointers up here, then I don't want to go that direction, right? So I'm definitely focused on these more expensive quarterbacks first and foremost. And then the cheaper guys kind of come into play behind that. Speaking of quarterback, I do want to get your thoughts on this Tom Brady situation, in that the Bucs are 4-point underdogs. Kyle Trask is going to be active this week. So the expectation is that they'll sit starters, but week 17, last week of the season in 2020, the Bucs were basically locked into the 5 seed. They couldn't finish with the 4 seed or higher. They couldn't fall, or they were highly unlikely to fall below the 5 seed. They played starters the entire game. That tracks with what Brady has done through most of his career with the Patriots in meaningless end of season games. So any thoughts on the Bucs, or I should say, any chance that you would mix in Bucs on tighter builds, right? The stuff that you're putting into single entry or 3 entry max, or is that something you would just reserve for large field play?
I think it's an intriguing option for large field play. I probably would not have it on like single entry or like tighter builds, because I think the risk is there, and it could be uncertain going into the game too, right? Like they could say, we're going to start everyone and play as normal, and then Tom Brady plays a half, and that wouldn't be such a departure. Whereas, and that like could potentially torpedo your lineup versus other lineups where the players are playing the full game. So I'm probably going to avoid the Bucs, but I do think it's intriguing for large field play, but probably like it's single digits ownership for everybody on Tampa Bay. just because I really do believe, and we saw this with the Jacksonville game last week, where if a team puts a player out there, especially like a highly known, highly paid player, and there's really nothing for the team to play for, and they get hurt, like I think that's a fireable offense for the coach. Like the coach should be fired in that situation, maybe even just for taking the risk. Like you can't. These guys make a lot of money. You can't, and if you're heading into the playoffs, like you cannot be risking an injury for a meaningless game. Now, like meaningless, like if it changes, seeding or something like that, then that's another situation. But I'm going to avoid guys that I think are not going to play the full game.
Yeah, no, I can see that argument. I think that one of the things that I try to balance in something like that is how high is the potential reward, right? And if we had this question before the Bucks game last week, then it would be like, well, the potential reward isn't even that high. Bucks actually team. I think we talked about the Bucks on this show last week. We definitely talked about them. I was talking about them late week last week in terms of how low Mike Evans' ownership was going to be and how high his ceiling actually was. After we saw what they did last week, and I see it as the type of spot where the Patriots over the years always treated like late season games as a chance to keep building momentum, getting in rhythm, keep getting better. And that was what the Bucks did in 2020. It was like, it was more valuable to keep building and prepping for the playoffs than it was to get players a little bit of extra rest. If the Bucks have Super Bowl aspirations, the most important thing for them is to stay in a rhythm. I could see mixing them onto, like, if I built 7 smaller field rosters that are going into different single entry contests, putting that on, like, let's say I typically have like 22 to 2,500 on my single entry to small field build, maybe having like $300 of that. So like 10% of my small field money, 15% of my small field money on that type of build. But I do think it's an interesting angle. Definitely one to play around with in large field. Definitely not like a core build, but in terms of teams that have nothing to play for, but it's not totally certain how they'll handle it, that's the one that's standing out to me. And then we always want to think about other spots like that in a week 18. Russell Gage, I think, is an interesting one. Hilo brought up in that game, in that even if the Bucs starters sit partway through, they're going to be limited on the number of active wide receivers. So Russell Gage will actually be playing the full game. Khalil Herbert's another guy where I went through the list of guys who had big week 18 games last year. And it was like Danny Amendola, Marvin Jones, Russell Gage, Dearness Johnson, Duke Johnson, right? Like not the young guys getting an opportunity, but these older guys. Khalil Herbert, a spot where David Montgomery is going to be a free agent in the offseason. They could move on from him. That's the type of spot where we could see them actually give Khalil Herbert more touches, shakes up your salary structure. But not a lot that I'm seeing from that angle so far this week of like, who are just the overlooked guys that could have a big game. Anything you're seeing in that regard?
Actually, you mentioned Dearness Johnson, and that's actually someone that is a little bit on my radar because I think Cleveland hasn't announced that they're going to rest anyone, but it would make sense for them to rest Nick Chubb. And like we've seen Dearness Johnson go crazy before. And so the setup is there. I'm actually a little bit, now that I think about it, a little bit intrigued in the entire Cleveland offense. Like Deshaun Watson is somebody that's on my radar because he's actually really cheap. And actually I'm kind of interested in veteran players who are like cheaper than they should be, who have something to play for. Like Miles Sanders actually fits this category as well. Like he's way too cheap. Like the Eagles obviously are playing for something. So I think I might end up being like more overweight on Miles Sanders than maybe anybody else. But like Dearness Johnson is somebody that like the narrative is kind of that he's been a third really good running back on that team that's kind of had to sacrifice with almost no touches this year. He was like brought up as a name at the trade deadline. Like they were going to try to move him for something if they could get something of value back. And we've seen him perform really well at the NFL level before. So that's a name that I'm interested in. It was funny you mentioned him as one of the Week 18 performers.
Yeah, and last year Nick Chubb was active. Nick Chubb got 9 carries. Dearness Johnson got 25, and it was sort of unannounced. And those are the sorts of things that can kind of happen in this week, which is why Khalil Herbert's one of the ones where it's like, who's the guy who, like the guy in that type of position who could just randomly get some extra touches. And at 4,600, he kind of shakes up the salary structure and allows you to potentially get the Jamar Chase plus Justin Jefferson plus A.J. Brown build that other people won't have, or not necessarily those exact players or that type of build, to where even if he misses, you can still end up with a really nice weekend because you're the only person who can fit in all these higher priced wide receivers. But yeah, there's a few different angles like that I think are interesting to play around. Dearness Johnson, definitely another one. And honestly, that Browns offense, because the Browns and Steelers both want to play this, like play for the fourth quarter type of game, right? Where it's like, let's run the ball, let's play for the fourth quarter. But the Steelers have the advantage in that, which means they're going to need to rely on Deshaun Watson to drive the field at some point at the end of the game and take the lead for them. If you're going to need to rely on him at the end of the game, why not rely on him early and then take a lead and then force the Steelers to actually move out of what they want to do? The Steelers will want to attack this bad Cleveland run defense with Najee Harris, kind of protect Kenny Pickett, allow him to throw these short passes, limit turnovers. Whereas if you take a 2-score lead early, you force Kenny Pickett to have to be more aggressive, increase your chances of winning that game. I don't actually think that that's how Kevin Stefanski will approach this game. We haven't seen him sort of proactively do stuff like that in the past. But I think it's a really interesting angle because if they do it, if they say, let's start building for next year, let's let Deshaun Watson just kind of take his lumps in this game if he's not ready. And if he is ready, now all of a sudden we jump out to this big lead against a division opponent, spoil their season. Pittsburgh still has a shot at the playoffs. I think it's a really interesting angle. Again, I think it's low probability, but the ceiling on it is really attractive because like Deshaun Watson would consistently finish with 30-plus points when he was the Texans quarterback the year that DeAndre Hopkins was gone. And so you think about with these weapons, with Njoku and Amari Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones, it's so obvious the ceiling. It's just they haven't let him do that type of approach yet. Would you consider that on tighter builds, or is that going to be large field for you as well?
I think, yeah, if I was doing like 6 rosters, I think a Deshaun Watson roster is reasonable, and I might not pair him with any of his receivers. But I would just he's really cheap. He's, we know he can run, and it would kind of make sense for them to try to get him some good, like have him have a really good game before the season ends.
Yeah.
Because they're going to face a lot of questions the whole offseason.
Yeah.
And Deshaun Watson, we know, is a high upside guy that, we've seen him put up points. We're kind of waiting for him. Like, oh, he might be a guy that, really breaks the later season, right? Like he breaks slates later in the season, and that is not materialized at all. But there have been some kind of one-off situations with that game against the Saints where it's freezing cold. So I think it would, like, if they can get him to like pad his stats a little bit, that would and knock the Steelers out of the playoffs. That gives them like something to say. Oh, we're building momentum towards the end of the season.
Yeah,
leaving that kind of narrative.
Yeah. On the one hand, I feel like I know Kevin Stefanski well enough that I don't feel comfortable that it's actually going to happen. But on the other hand, it's like it's so obvious that I feel like the chances are probably higher than my knowledge of Kevin Stefanski gives it credit for. So I definitely like that angle right there. At the running back position, are you seeing I think at the top of the running back pool is pretty thin, right? Austin Eckler is 8,900 in a game that's not super important for the Chargers. Austin Eckler has only topped 16 touches 3 times in his last 8 games, and yet he's 8,900. Saquon Barkley, obviously at high risk. Nick Chubb, you mentioned that at high risk. Joe Mixon in a tough matchup. Tony Pollard doesn't get a ton of touches. Connor will be out. Ramondre Stevenson playing Buffalo. So that really, it's like Dalvin Cook and Christian McCaffrey are really the only guys up here who stand out on paper. Any thoughts on those guys or anybody else at the higher ends of the running back price range?
My biggest question is Christian McCaffrey, because I am worried that he's not going to play the full game. But it's in the late slate. So I might not worry about it too much. And like he is a guy that could maybe break a slate in a half, like if they just play him a half. Austin Eckler is another guy that's kind of in the same situation, although I'm much less high on him than McCaffrey, obviously. But it's important to remember the course of the season for the Chargers, where they were missing all of their wide receivers for a good portion of the season. Like Keenan Allen and Mike Williams have both missed huge, big stretches, sometimes at the same time. And that's when Austin Eckler went berserk and games. And now that they have everybody healthy, like he's not seeing as many touches. And like similar to the start of the season, he didn't see a ton of touches either. I started to write down the running backs, like the kind of higher priced running backs that I was interested in. And I realized I was writing up a bunch of like still lower priced running backs. Like Walker, Miles Sanders, like Tyler Algier. These guys are all like Najee Harris. These guys are all fairly cheap. And they're the most certain guys on the running back slate. And now I think we're starting to get guys like, Jonathan Williams. I think is Keontae Ingram in Arizona that'll probably be playing James Conner. He's actually somebody I'm a little bit interested in. I hope he doesn't gain steam. I thought it was interesting they had Eno Benjamin early in the season, and I think Conner was hurt, and we all expected like Eno Benjamin was going to have a huge game, but it was actually they kind of split it with Keontae Ingram. So I think he's somebody that they're high on. like Dearness Johnson, Khalil Herbert, Cam Akers, and then Matt Breida is actually somebody I'm a little bit interested in.
Yep. I think that's interesting as well.
I won't necessarily play him a lot because I think they could consider him like a starter, right? Like he's maybe a valued backup. But I don't know like who the third string guy would be for the Giants. Like I'd be surprised if Saquon Barkley sees the field at all.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting angle. You mentioned Cam Akers. I was going through the numbers for Cam Akers. His last 5 games have basically been like a mirror image of what Kenneth Walker has done in his 9 games in the lead role. And I think that because of the way that Cam Akers' season has developed and all of the weird storylines and how bad this Rams offense has been for stretches of the season, it's easy to look at him as like in a tier below the Kenneth Walker, Miles Sanders type guys. But yeah, I mean, I think that he's equally interesting to those guys. It's an interesting thing because the field is valuing him at the same level. Like ownership on Cam Akers is coming in at the same level as these other guys. But I think that really sharp, like people who know the NFL really well can tend to be like, oh, well, Cam Akers doesn't belong in this conversation. And so they don't end up with Cam Akers on their roster. So just to note that he's kind of like, he was the guy who, before I was looking at the numbers, he was like, okay, he doesn't quite fit with Kenneth Walker and with Miles Sanders. And then it's like, oh, wait, he actually does, So Cam Akers, Najee Harris, Miles Sanders, all those guys are very interesting. Any thoughts on Dalvin Cook we kind of skipped over him at 7,300?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm kind of focused on Justin Jefferson in that game. And there's the narrative with the possibly breaking the single season receiving yardage record. So yeah, Dalvin Cook is interesting. Was it 8,000 on FanDuel going against the Bears? That is interesting. In my mind, I'm thinking that if they have plays to spare, like they might take Dalvin Cook out early. And if they have plays to spare, like if they're up big, they might keep throwing to Justin Jefferson to try to get the receiving record. But they're not going to necessarily throw Dalvin Cook out there enough for him to put up a tournament winning score, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that there's a few sides to it, right? I don't think that Minnesota approaches this game any differently because they still have a shot. In the backs of their minds, they're like, San Francisco is not going to lose to Arizona in the late game, but they do still need to play it to win because they still have a shot at the 2 seed. But yeah, and Dalvin Cook, 75% of the snaps throughout most of this season. I do think that Dalvin Cook still gets his normal role until they're in like a big lead, right? But also his normal role has only led to 4 useful tournament games this year. The angle that I really think is interesting here is something we talked about earlier this year, which is the fact that in 3 of Dalvin's 4 games where he hit, Justin Jefferson also hit. And Dalvin's looking like he's going to be somewhat popular this week, which means that most of those Dalvin rosters don't get the Justin Jefferson score. So I do like the angle. Like I'll play a lot of Justin Jefferson without Dalvin Cook, but I won't play Dalvin Cook without Justin Jefferson more than likely, because I feel like that's part of the edge is saying, okay, Dalvin's big games have mostly come in just big Vikings games. Jefferson gets there as well. And then if I get this 28-pointer from Dalvin, well, now I know that the other 20% of the field getting this score is not getting the 30-pointer from Justin Jefferson. So if I end up getting those 2 stacked together, I think that becomes an interesting strategy edge. But yeah, Dalvin in a vacuum doesn't really like leap off the page to me. Justin Jefferson's my favorite play on the slate. So, but I think that's an interesting way to kind of pair Dalvin is to say, throw Justin Jefferson on one of those rosters. Of course, that takes away the salary flexibility to go to one of these other expensive wide receivers, which you also have to account for. But yeah, that's kind of how I'm seeing that spot.
Wondering about Alexander Madison, and if that's like for a larger field, that might be an interesting like Madison. I'm assuming he's 5,100 on DraftKings. That saves you a little bit of money. I get worried about the teams that have good backup running backs, because there is that thought that like the backup running backs maybe sacrificing a little bit by not getting as many touches. And I think we actually expected that to be more of a split coming into the season. Like I think Dalvin has been playing more, at least in my mind, than I expected. Like Alexander Madison looked really good last season, and that might be like kind of like a Dearness Johnson situation where I wonder. I'm just worried because like the Bears starting quarterbacks like Nathan Peterman, so the game might not be competitive.
Yeah.
If if the spread moves.
And that's Nathan Peterman comes out and pulls a Jarrett Stidham on us and just swings it all over the yard. But that's definitely concerning.
I could see them still throwing to Justin Jefferson to get the receiving record, but maybe pulling Dalvin Cook and putting in Alexander Madison.
Yeah, I remember watching a Vikings game earlier this year, and Madison had the ball, and I was like, man, why don't they play this guy more? And then Dalvin Cook came back on the field. And he like ripped off a big run, and I was like, oh, this is why they don't play Alexander Madison more. But Madison's like really good when he gets work.
So moving on to wide receiver, something that I just realized like right before we came on the show is that the Packers-Lions game is on the FanDuel slate again. The Sunday night show or the Sunday night game is on.
Shout out to FanDuel there.
But this time it's not in place of another game. They just included the whole day Sunday. So that actually puts it like Aaron Rodgers and the Packers maybe in play, against Detroit. And that might affect, both the quarterback position and wide receiver. And I guess Jared Goff is probably in play as well.
Yeah. I mean, any opportunity to play that Lions offense, I'll always take it. And I think most people start their thoughts on DraftKings. And so they're not going to be thinking about that game as much if they're playing on FanDuel. And so the fact that game is in play, you add in Amon-Ra St. Brown, DeAndre Swift, Jared Goff, a lot of guys to like in that Lions offense. And then obviously the Packers offense has been rolling of late. Should be a really good game. I'm hoping Seattle loses in the early games, and then we get that winner of that goes in instead of just if the Packers win, they go in. Because if Seattle loses, Detroit's in play for that final spot with a win. So that would be pretty fun.
Yeah, and it's worth noting the Packers, I think, have the second highest implied point total after the Eagles on the entire slate on FanDuel. So it's something to keep in mind, for FanDuel only pricing. But yeah, the wide receiver position, I think there's going to be a common build, at least a common salary structure this week where people are spending down at running back. Because like Justin Jefferson, I think, my favorite player on the slate. It sounds like, for you as well. Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, all high-priced wide receivers who have something to play for and can break a slate. And then there's still some value as well. Like Garrett Wilson still isn't priced up as high as he should be, and he gets Joe Flacco now. And then there's some value, including like even Gabe Davis, who hasn't.
But
he's really cheap. And so that's a player that like some of these veterans kind of fits in like the Deshaun Watson, Miles Sanders. Gabe Davis is right in there. It's like a veteran guy who has something to play for, who isn't priced up as much. And so as people are looking for these like value plays that are having a role change, like maybe just play Gabe Davis. He's in the same role, but we know he can break a slate.
Yeah, I think we'll see. It should be at least like half the rosters have at least one pay up running back, right? Because Christian McCaffrey's coming in over 20% projected owned. Dalvin Cook's coming in over 20% projected owned. And there's just such a habit built in of paying up at one running back spot. But I think we'll see a much larger chunk of the field than normal with a double pay down at running back. And then this sort of salary structure. And like you said, I mean, you mentioned some guys who aren't the typical like sub 4K pay downs, but they're still underpriced. Garrett Wilson and Gabe Davis. And you could even throw Jacoby Myers in there, although not quite at the same level as those guys. Drake London. There's definitely some guys in here who are attractive from a standpoint of what you can get from a ceiling perspective for the salary. I'll also throw in one guy. You mentioned Garrett Wilson. One guy who I really like is Corey Davis. When you're talking about guys who just literally nobody will notice, and then the slate ends and they put up 20 points and people are like, oh yeah, I can see how that could have happened. He's 3,500. His last 3 healthy games, 6, 7, and 10 targets. So you're talking about now Flacco comes in, passing volume will be elevated compared to at least with Zach Wilson under center. He should be in line for anywhere from 7 to 10 targets on the perimeter downfield role with a quarterback in Flacco who's willing to take those downfield shots. So I think there's some cheaper guys like that. Obviously, Rashid Shaheed's going to be popular. Greg Dortch saw 10 targets last week, right? I think he'll be a little bit lower owned because he didn't produce on those, but that's now 5 of his 6 like super active games where he's seen 9 to 11 targets. And you can basically bank on 9 to 11 targets for this guy at 3,800. He's put up 15 plus points in 2/3 of those games without scoring touchdowns, right? He has 1 touchdown in his high volume games. And so, I mean, he's another guy who is interesting at like the way pay down range. And then from the standpoint of like who could just randomly get some extra run, we mentioned Russell Gage already as a guy who he should actually be playing the full game because, they're going to have 6 wide receivers active. 2 of those will be Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. And those guys will be off the field probably somewhat early. So then Russell Gage ends up playing the whole game for the Buccaneers. So, yeah, there's some interesting places to look at wide receiver. And I think it's one of those spots where wide receiver will end up being one of the difference makers on the slate. You got to kind of find maybe the one guy who people aren't on who can blow up, or be on the correct high-owned guys who end up hitting this week.
Yeah. And so just moving on to the tight end position, like more veterans, like Corey Davis is an interesting call. Mark Andrews and Hayden Hurst are the guys I've got written down. Just like veteran guys, again, not as like we've seen Mark Andrews have his price plummet. I think he was like 7,500 on FanDuel, and now I think he's like 5,300. He's priced way down, but he finally had the good game. Like he's 5,400 on DraftKings. Finally had the good game we've been waiting a little bit for. And they still just reduced his price. So it was 5,200 last week. So he went up a little bit. Yeah, 22 DraftKings points. But still only 5,400. And like Hayden Hurst is down at 3,100. I think he's got like a little bit of a contract incentive as well that he can meet this week. And the Bengals are a team that have something to play for. So like Cincinnati is a team like I'm interested from Joe Burrow, Joe Mixon, all the way down to Jamar Chase, all the way down to Hayden Hurst.
Yeah, what I like about Andrews is how well he fits into one of those Burrow builds as well, because if the Bengals are we know that the Ravens want to run the ball, but if the Bengals are putting up points, which is what you'd be betting on with a Burrow Chase build, a Burrow Higgins build, a Burrow whatever build, then you force the Ravens to throw the ball a little bit more. And if they throw the ball a little bit more, Mark Andrews is the guy who's going to be involved, and his chance of hitting become pretty high. So like it would be hard for me to play a Burrow build without bringing it back with Mark Andrews. We also have Dallas Goedert, right, at 4,900, capable of putting up 20-plus points. And Alberto Cuevunam at 2,900. Greg Dulcich is out. He's going to be on the field this week. And somebody that they've talked about wanting to see him on the field, see what he can do after he's been kind of buried this season. So what did he have last week? He had 3 catches for 45 yards and a touchdown, 6 targets. So he's pretty interesting to me at 2,900 as well as a way to save salary at tight end.
It's interesting. We end up on these guys that people were high on at the beginning of the season. Like Alberto, Cam Akers kind of fits that mold.
Yep.
You said at the beginning of the season, like, yeah, Cam Akers might be the best running back or most popular running back going into week 18. You go, like that makes total sense. Like he almost got released.
Yeah, his path to getting there was very different than expected.
Yeah, so it should be an interesting week. I think defense is like I don't have a lot of thoughts other than I'm probably going to spread it way out. And obviously like focusing on teams facing backup quarterbacks, rookie quarterbacks, and teams with maybe some low implied point totals, although the scoring doesn't matter that much for defensive scoring in fantasy. Any quick thoughts on defense?
Yeah, I mean, 49ers, Eagles, Cowboys, 3 most expensive on DraftKings, but all likely playing backup quarterbacks if the Giants don't start Daniel Jones, and all with plenty to play for. And I think that they'll be all a little bit lower owned just because of the price tags. But then obviously you've got the Vikings, the Jets, the Texans, these cheaper defenses that are all attractive. So I like the idea of finding with the savings available, finding a way to pay up at defense. But there are a lot of different directions to go at defense this week. And I think the most important thing is just you got to stay up with news all the way through kickoff on Sunday. And even if you're building a lot of rosters, have a plan for how you pivot if news shifts, because being able to pivot when the time comes is going to be one of the most important things if certain situations pop up.
So I've got to pay attention to news and late swap. It's a perfect transition into NBA season.
Yep.
It's been a great season. That'll just about wrap it up. Any final thoughts?
No, tons of fun doing the show this year. Looking forward to next year.
All right. Good luck, everybody. Hope you had a good season watching, and hopefully see you guys next season.